For the third election in a row, the Republican Party has chosen Donald Trump as their presidential nominee. And today he chose Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate. Mr. Vance has only been in the U.S. Senate for 18 months. He's never otherwise held public office at all. He wrote a book about white working class despair. He worked as a venture capitalist. He went to Yale Law School, which is where he met his wife, who works at a high-end law firm in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., or at least she did until today, when she quit that firm after her husband was nominated to be Trump's running mate. Mr. Vance worked as a CNN contributor. He was a public affairs officer in Iraq with the United States Marine Corps. But as a running mate for Donald Trump, it is unavoidable to note that his record of remarks about Trump is one that I think could reasonably be described as rich. Maybe that's the word, rich.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
It makes you think that at a fundamental level, this is sort of a he said, she said, right? And at the end of the day, do you believe Donald Trump, who always tells the truth? Just kidding. Or do you believe that woman on that tape?
I cannot stand Trump because I think he's a fraud. Well, I think he's a total fraud that is exploiting these people, who is a total fraud.
Like you said, I agree with you on Trump because I don't think that he's the person. I don't think he actually cares about folks.
So as a conservative who thinks that Trump does not have the answers and isn't qualified to be president, what are you going to do this election, if you don't mind saying?
My current plan is to vote either third party or, as I joke to my wife, I might write in my dog, because that's about as good as it seems. But, you know, I think there's a chance, if I feel like Trump has a really good chance of winning, that I might have to hold my nose and vote for Hillary Clinton. Ultimately, I think I'll probably vote third party. I might vote for this new guy who I really like, Evan McMullin, who I actually met the other day. But I think that I'm going to vote third party because I can't stomach Trump. I think that he's noxious and is leading the white working class to a very dark place.
Donald Trump's new running mate. I will vote for my dog over him. I will vote for a guy I just met, Evan McMullin, or Hillary Clinton, or some other third-party entity I can't even name. I will not vote for him because he is noxious and he is leading us in this country to a very dark place. He calls him a total fraud. In addition to that clip you saw there of him on MSNBC on Hardball with Chris Matthews saying that he believed a woman when she testified in the E. Jean Carroll case that she was sexually assaulted by Trump. He believed her, not Trump. He also liked a tweet around the same time saying that Trump had committed serial sexual assaults. Another one just calling Trump a monster. He has called Trump a moral disaster. He's called him cultural heroin. He has called him reprehensible. He has also called him, quote, an idiot. J.D. Vance is a very good writer. He wrote in a very good New York Times op-ed that, quote, Trump is unfit for our nation's highest office. He wrote to one former roommate about Trump, quote, I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical a-hole like Nixon or that he's America's Hitler. How's that for discouraging? End quote. After this weekend's horrific shooting at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, that assassination attempt against Trump that bloodied the former president, that killed a man, that wounded two others, J.D. Vance, now a U.S. Senator, posted online that it was Democrats' criticism of Trump as anti-democratic that, in his words, quote, led directly to the assassination attempt against Trump. Led directly. Many political observers went on the record this weekend saying that if J.D. Vance was indeed still on the short list to be considered to be Trump's running mate, that online post, that tweet from him this weekend saying that Democrats led directly to the assassination attempt against Trump, that surely would have disqualified him from staying on the short list. But he says that Democrats' criticism of Trump led directly to that assassination attempt, despite the fact that he himself called Trump America's Hitler. J.D. Vance says he has changed, that he no longer thinks all those terrible things that he has said about Trump in the past. And, you know, maybe that's true. Who among us knows what is in a man's heart? But in J.D. Vance's public positions now, there's nothing, literally nothing about Trump that Vance is not endorsing and indeed advancing. You may remember J.D. Vance coming to Trump's criminal trial in New York. He called it a sham trial. And while he was there, he attacked not only the judge in the case, but the judge's family. And he made sure to dress exactly like Trump while he did it. He has decided that he, too, is against windmills. Terrible, ugly windmills, he calls them. One of the weirdest Trump pet peeves of all. J.D. Vance has adopted that now for himself as well, just as he's adopted the red tie, white shirt thing. He calls people convicted for crimes related to the January 6th attack, quote, political prisoners. He says the 2020 election was not a real election. He says he will not commit to accepting the results of the next election in 2024. It is, of course, unusual for a president to run for a second term with a different running mate than they had in their first term. But clearly, Mike Pence was no longer available. Mike Pence not an option for Donald Trump this time around after the violent mob Trump unleashed on the Capitol looked for Mike Pence to try to hang him while Trump egged them on. Vice President Pence has since made history as saying that he explicitly cannot endorse his former running mate for a second term in office. How do you talk yourself into wanting Trump to pick you for this job when the last guy Trump picked for this job, he also nearly got killed when he told an armed violent mob that Pence was the man to blame for all they were so upset about? J.D. Vance told CNN this year that he doesn't think that Mike Pence was ever really in any real danger on January 6th. He also says that had he been Mike Pence, had he been vice president himself on January 6, 2021, he would have thrown out the real electoral votes and done what Trump wanted. The lead story in the New York Times on Saturday night before the terrible shooting happened in Pennsylvania was this story about how Republicans have already laid the groundwork to have their officials all over the country refuse to certify the election results this year. Groups like the Heritage Foundation are saying publicly that some sort of amorphous conditions exist in the country now, right now, that already justify any election official at any level refusing to certify the results. They are already intending that the election results will not be certified. And that is intended, and it may very well prevent any normal count of the vote this year, any normal tally of the votes, including in the Electoral College. The idea is that there will just be chaos in Washington. There will be a fight, some kind of actual fight for power in Washington, instead of it being decided by our votes in the states. Well, now, as of tonight, they've got as a running mate for Trump someone who is committed and who is insisting that there was nothing wrong with what happened on January 6th. It's just that it didn't work. And if he'd been there, it would have worked. So put him in there. As we've been discussing tonight, J.D. Vance wants a national abortion ban. He thinks even rape and incest survivors should be forced to give birth against their will. He thinks women who are being violently abused by their husbands should be made to stay in their marriage. So, J.D. Vance has a lot to offer in terms of his policy positions that are very unpopular with most of the American public. That said, he does also say that Trump should have been able to seize power despite the vote in 2020. And if you're going to hold power despite the vote, despite the expressed will of the people, then your unpopular positions will never be a problem for you ever again, because nobody gets to vote on who's in office.
Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. He is now, tonight, we can tell you, formally nominated. That was within the last hour. Selecting a running mate is a major decision in any campaign. That's always true and always a big deal. But this one today comes amidst the many other significant developments right now that we're covering and that, frankly, we're all living through as a country. This whirlwind of activity includes a lot of things you probably know about. It ranges from the horrific attempted assassination of the former president at the Pennsylvania rally, where that now deceased shooter was able to fire at former President Trump's head, grazing his right ear before snipers killed the shooter, and a firefighter attending that rally also tragically killed. This was a harrowing attack that echoes across our nation and the world. I'm showing you just some of the headlines here, and it's also driving very important questions about what is a clear security lapse. And as a nation, we care about that because that would affect the Secret Service's competence and the confidence we have in it to protect all of the people under Secret Service protection. That would include, of course, the current president, the presidential nominees, and others. This convention, meanwhile, begins with official business today. The state delegation roll call vote, which does make Donald Trump the official Republican presidential nominee. If you recall all the conversation last couple weeks about when the Democratic nomination becomes official because of the questions about the president after the debate, well, here's an example in real life today. You're looking at that raucous, patriotic environment, the roll call vote. He is the nominee. And as Trump readies to return through the convention this week, he also got a huge win in court against Jack Smith today in the documents prosecution, a judge tossing that entire case, a Trump-appointed judge. The Justice Department making news late tonight, as I was just getting ready to come on air, that they will appeal that ruling, and we have more on that important case later tonight. As for Senator J.D. Vance, since jumping into Senate politics about 2 years ago, he has branded himself a Trump loyalist. So recent Vance is Trump on policy and style. He auditioned as a fighter, traveled to attend Trump's criminal trial, launched political attacks that go really beyond even what Trump himself would sometimes say. And he has a conservative voting record for the brief time he's been in the Senate. That, as I tell you, as a factual matter, is recent Vance. But as a rookie senator, he has far less of a record or experience than most people on the national ticket. He's been a senator for 2 years. At 39 years old, he is one of the youngest running mates. And this is a time where, again, we say this carefully, judiciously, and respectfully, but this is a time where the death of a potential or current president has been discussed, frankly, about both presidential nominees. So if Senator Vance assumed the presidency, say in the short term, in the next year or two, he would be one of both the least experienced and youngest presidents ever. Quite a combination. Now, Vance has cleared those hurdles with Trump, clearly, who touted his Yale pedigree and his service as a Marine. Now, Trump is not necessarily known for reading. He talks more about other medium than, say, long-form books. But today, former President Trump mentioned Vance's book, Hillbilly Eulogy. And what is striking is that since that writing, Vance has used basically his writing, political commentary, and ultimately the platform of that book as a way of arguing for a separation from what he dubbed essentially a kind of honest or old school conservatism as distinct from emerging Trumpism. Before Donald Trump won in 2016, Vance, announced today as Donald Trump's running mate, called Donald Trump noxious, reprehensible, and a, quote, idiot. He likened Trump's ability to hook the needy and the gullible as a use of kind of, quote, cultural heroin, something our colleague Nicole Walls just mentioned. That is some of the past criticism. Vance, now promoted by following a current, recent Republican tradition when it comes to dealing with Donald Trump. If you can't beat him, join him. Now, joining us first from the RNC reporting is Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, this is truly breaking news. We've seen now Senator Vance on the floor there where you are. He was there recently. What is the reception? What are you seeing in your reporting and the reception of the delegates? Because this is new information. They'd heard Vance was on the short list. Now he's the running mate.
Right. I think, in conversation with a few of the delegates that this is being well received because let's be very clear. J.D. Vance over the last several years has been somebody that is, I think, been a not only ardent, loyal supporter of Donald Trump, but also an articulate messenger for what a second Trump administration could look like and what this America First ideology looks like in the vision of Donald Trump, and better shaped by some people like him and Josh Hawley. And J.D. Vance, he was elected just in 2022. He's only been in the U.S. Senate for 18 months. But the folks here, of course, they know him from the Hillbilly Elegy story, and there is sort of a national recognition of who he is largely off of that. There is a connection that is based off of that identity. And so for Donald Trump picking him as his running mate is notable here. We are in the middle of what is essentially the convention dinner break here. Everybody should be convening, the more than 2,000 delegates. About a half hour from now, you're going to see the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, Glenn Youngkin, Senator Tim Scott speaking here on this Monday night, the first night of primetime. And of course, you saw J.D. Vance walk out here to cheers. And this was a moment where, let's be very clear here, Ari, I would say that there was not a clear-cut favorite to be Donald Trump's running mate. Of course, there may have been nobody more loyal to him than Mike Pence for a little more than 4 years until January 6, 2021. But when you're looking at the folks who he was considering, a good number of them had either said negative things about Donald Trump in the past, or they were perhaps not palatable to a larger part of the electorate, say a Marjorie Taylor Greene or a Matt Gaetz. And that is what ultimately, despite the 8-year history between these two men, led to Donald Trump selecting J.D. Vance as the running mate, vice presidential candidate with these 113 days left.
Yeah, and Vaughn, when you look at what I mentioned before, we are living through this absolute horrific, tragic attack, this attempted assassination of a former president and current, now today, presidential nominee officially of the Republican Party. That is a huge and significant thing that hangs over all of this. From a governing perspective, as we all understand, that's why the running mate, potentially, if elected, the vice president, plays a significant role. You couldn't really script a more dramatic, albeit tragic, on-ramp for Vance, having everyone held their breath to see whether any of those shots aimed at the nominee's head connected. He lived through it, and that is hanging over the convention, as you'll be covering for us. So can you walk us through what that feels like today and the relative, not only inexperience we mentioned, but also youth, a very young person backing up a nominee who, like the current president, both of them, as we've mentioned, are elderly candidates?
39 years old. And in a lot of ways, Don Jr. has become especially close with J.D. Vance. And in these last months was at the forefront of pressing for him to be that vice presidential nominee here. Of course, watching the events unfold just about 48 hours ago now was a cloud that was hanging over this entire convention. I was talking to one delegate earlier who said that everybody here in this room has been to a Trump rally before, and they viewed what happened there as a situation they each could have found themselves in. Dave McCormick, the U.S. Senate candidate for Pennsylvania, he was there in that front row at that rally. And, for each of these elected officials, they usually have those prominent seats here. And so I think in a lot of ways, political violence and exactly what America finds itself here in 2024, I think really came to a head here in July of 2024 here, right before this Republican convention. And I don't think that anybody is naive to the importance of a vice presidential pick and the extent to which somebody like a J.D. Vance, now having had at least a little bit of time, 18 months to build relationships in the U.S. Congress, is a major factor as opposed to somebody like a Doug Burgum, who is serving the state of North Dakota as a governor.
Vaughn Hilliard on the convention floor there. We will be coming back to you all night and all week. So thank you for your reporting. Stay safe and rested. I turn now to Bill Kristol, who is a bit of a vice presidential expert himself, having advised and served in the White House for a Republican vice president. You also, as we know, have been critical of Donald Trump in your current work. Welcome back. Bill, we've met through our reporting many times. We meet here at a very serious time after watching the terrible attack and the political violence this weekend, and now onboarding into everything that's happening today. Let's start with J.D. Vance. What does he bring to the ticket? What do you see as his strengths? Obviously, the nominee here who's in a good position, Donald Trump, thinks this is a strengthening of the ticket. And what do you see as his potential pitfalls?
Ari, it's really a radical pick. I'm not sure people have fully focused on this. J.D. Vance is not just, Trump had other picks of people who were loyal to him, who would cater to him, who would bow down to him, but who were not election deniers, who were not against aid to Ukraine. J.D. Vance's position on Ukraine is not that of Speaker Mike Johnson. It's not that of Tim Scott or Tom Cotton or a lot of other people who are pretty pro-Trump. Vance is, if anything, more anti-Ukraine than Trump has been for the last year. Vance is totally on board with election denial, with being pro-January 6th hostages. Vance has gone further than the Heritage Project 2025 report in saying we should have 50,000 political appointees, but we should fire every civil servant and have loyalty tests instead. So Vance is a radical pick. Whatever his views were 8 years ago, one can talk about that and talk about his sincerity. But, many authoritarian movements end up staffed by people who didn't start off as authoritarians and who are ambitious. But he is there, and he is a radical authoritarian, and Trump has picked him.
Well, you're drawing people's attention to his positions, which also fit into the political position of the nominee, Donald Trump, and what he thinks he needs to do. Last cycles, he needed to shore up other wings of the party. And Mike Pence, while many people would say on certain policies, certainly on church and state and other issues, was a very strong conservative. On other issues you just mentioned, the Constitution, democracy as opposed to other attacks on it, he represented something different. And it may have been through the need to build a coalition that Trump picked Pence. We all know how that ended. And here he's picked someone that you're saying might reflect Trump's apparent confidence. We don't know what's going to happen in the election, but he apparently doesn't feel he needs to build from any other wing. You're saying that it's now double MAGA.
Yeah, this is doubling down. It's a very confident pick, I suppose. He doesn't need some of those Nikki Haley type voters who kind of care about helping Ukraine, who don't want to see every civil servant politicized, who aren't really fond of the election denial. He doesn't seem to think he needs those voters. I think, from my point of view, this is a scary pick. It's, in my view, more dangerous for the country if he's vice president. But it's a risky pick for Trump because I do think it's not obviously as politically smart as pick.
Since the assassination attempt of Trump on Saturday, that obviously is going to loom large, not only in this news cycle and in this election, but in American history. As we are now a couple of days out from that, do you feel like the conversation around that is getting more responsible, less responsible? It's moving on in any constructive way?
I mean, I think it depends on what audience. Obviously, there's still, a lot of like conspiracy theories, a lot of doubt, a lot of things that are going on sort of in the ether, sort of around what happened. But, I have to say that, I actually experienced that breaking news while I was at a wonderful thing called BlurredCon. It's the Black nerds, of which I am one. I like to think of myself as their princess. So I'm at BlurredCon, when we were just like chilling, like going to one of the food trucks and doing that. And that's when it started to pop into everybody's phones. Yeah. And so I had a chance to actually talk to a lot of people in real time and to get sort of people's first instant reaction. And then, of course, more reactions have been coming in, both the, I always talk about whether it's the official people or the civilians. Yeah. And whether it's civilians or officials. And then on top of it, then the news today out of Miami about, what Judge Aileen Cannon did. I will say that the kind of universal kind of reaction that I'm getting, whether it's civilians or, professionals, is really a deep concern and lack of confidence in not us at this table or us at MSNBC, but us as the media writ large. And a fear that what's going to happen now is that the Republican Party will do what they do. They're in the middle of a campaign. The convention started today. But the media will acquiesce to trying to convince people that the things they've been experiencing for the last 5-6 years didn't happen. That the greatest purveyor and promoter of political violence, really, since anyone can remember, since George Wallace, I think, that we just haven't experienced that kind of open, sort of citing or sort of incitement of violence or sort of luxuriating in the idea of violence. It's just not something we're used to anymore in American politics. And then we had to get used to that being a thing. And people are concerned and expressing concern that we won't be the guardians of memory and that we will allow Donald Trump, as he is, bathed in the glory and grandeur of his party, to rewrite himself as both a hero and a victim, that people who are the most vulnerable to not just the things he's done, but the things he's promising to do, and that will then happen without a guardian saying, wait, stop, and then the media will acquiesce to this rewrite. And the people that I've been talking to don't accept the rewrite. They still remember that this person said, get him out, I'll pay your legal fees. They still remember that Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene did ads where they had long guns and were firing at pictures of Nancy Pelosi and have been promoting the idea that the Democrats, the left, the liberals, it'll be peaceful, said the Heritage Foundation leader, if the left allows it. People haven't forgotten those threats. And they don't want us to forget them either. And
at the same time, Donald Trump, I mean, for all the using the idea of victimization as a political trope, he is legitimately the victim of this attempt. And I was, looking back at history, looking at previous political violence in our country, and all of the presidential candidates and indeed presidents who have been shot at And, you know, we've had 4 presidents assassinated. We've had an incredible history of political violence in this country. But one thing that's true over time, when you look back at that whole string, going all the way back to the 1800s, is that the motive of the person committing the violence is never relevant.
Very true.
The act of violence itself ends politics, turns it over into crime, and makes the views and the motivations of the shooter irrelevant. Everybody in politics, no matter where you are ideologically, must unite around the idea that violence is unacceptable.
Absolutely.
And it's unacceptable both when it comes to targeted stuff like this, but it's also unacceptable when you try to incite that as a way of getting things that you want that you can't get through political means. So it's true in terms of violent rhetoric. It's true in violence orientation toward the idea of confrontation with your fellow Americans. And of course, it's true in the case of some sort of insane event like we saw on Saturday in Pennsylvania. And I just feel like obviously we're all very grateful that President Trump was not more seriously hurt. We are all absolutely shattered by the fact that somebody was killed.
Somebody was killed,
2 people
yeah.
were put in the hospital very seriously hurt. But I am hoping that the one positive thing that can come out of this is some sobriety around the idea of violence in politics being no freaking joke. And nothing that anybody should play with ever.
Yeah.
And you're right, you can't be ahistorical about it. And we do need to think of it as a spectrum while being completely real about the risks of this to everybody. Violence, among everything else, is very unpredictable. Once it's part of your political system, you never know which direction it's going to go.
Yeah.
Nobody can harness it in one direction only. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and if I could just very quick, I don't want to monopolize the time, but, you know, the one time I've ever been afraid doing this job, honestly, was in 2016 in Cleveland, when men, because it's an open carry state, Ohio, were pacing in front of our position with long guns, with AR-15s, in a way to menace us. As we were in our outdoor positions, they felt that they needed to send a message to us visually with their firearms. And I think about the people who tried to vote in Arizona when men with long guns were standing outside of those polling places to send them a message. You don't vote the right way. I'm here with this gun. And so the idea of political violence that we've been nursing really since then is so dangerous.
Yeah.
It's so dangerous that you cannot avoid the consequences of it, even if you're one of the people promoting it.
No, that's right. And the political system collapses under the threat of violence.
Absolutely.
Because that is the end of politics and the beginning just of the use of force.
I didn't know if we were going to be this real, but as long as we're going there, I'll say this. I've worked on a half a dozen campaigns, and I've never needed any sort of security from the other side. I mean, I worked on Republican campaigns, and I was never under any threat, verbal or physical, from any of the opposing campaigns. Since I've had this job covering the Trump movement, everyone that goes to rallies from every news organization has security. Most people who are in the public arena rely on security to protect their families. In a post-Paul Pelosi moment, you thought some circuit might trip and break. It didn't. They mocked him. They made fun of him and the circumstances around his attack. In a post-Gabby Giffords America, you thought we might have a real conversation.
In a post-Steve Scalise.
And nothing has changed the conversation. It is sick and sad that Trump was targeted. It is an epic tragedy that my parents go to Trump rallies. It is an epic tragedy that someone who was there to support their candidate died protecting their family. There is nothing that can be done. There's something that can be done. There can be loud, platformed condemnation of the violence, and it doesn't come from across the ideological spectrum.
Yeah. And I will say that in this moment, I also feel like when talking about it being like, is this going to be a different type of moment? Is there going to be an outbreak of sobriety? I mean, part of that means being forgiving and soft-hearted toward people who have done the wrong thing in the past who now want to do the right thing. Right? I mean, one of the things that has happened in the wake of some of these other violent incidents is that people who have said, you know, I've used rhetoric in the past that now when I reflect on it is not the kind of rhetoric that I'll use again. That's good. That sort of thing ought to be encouraged. We're going to see a little bit of that in the clip they've released already from President Biden speaking with Lester Holt, talking about some language that he's used in terms of targeting Trump and whether or not that could have been misconstrued by somebody, and the president engaging in some reflection about that. I mean, part of the idea here about this being a different type of moment is that we should experience some growth as a nation and that there should be self-reflection by everybody in the public arena. But that also doesn't mean we have to give up being clear-eyed about the magnitude of the threats and where they're coming from.
Exactly. I mean, and we'll talk about the clip of President Biden and him being asked about language he used, using targeted and using bullet, using language that's around gun violence, which is certainly not what he meant, I think, in that moment. But it is important to think about your words. I also will say, though, I mean, Donald Trump just selected somebody for his vice presidential running mate who tweeted this. Today is not just some isolated incident, and this is after, of course, the tragedy that happened on Saturday. The central premise of the Biden campaign is that President Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. The rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination. So, yes, I think we do always need to give people a bridge to do the right thing, and maybe this is a moment for that. But that is the person who has just joined the ticket with Donald Trump, and I think it's important not to forget that either.
And I think, you know, the choice of J.D. Vance had not been announced when J.D. Vance tweeted that out. And so there was still a possibility, if we were going to have like a change of course here as a country, once he said Democrats did this, Democrats, the word there,
Joe Biden did this.
Led directly to is the phrase that he used there, right? Once he said that and blamed it in a partisan way like that, there was an option in the Republican Party and in the Trump campaign to then not pick J.D. Vance.
But let's heed Joy's warning. Let's not memory hole who Trump is. It's probably why he picked him.
Yeah. It probably helped him.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Ari?
I would just add that why did this happen is a question that could be answered slowly through an investigation, or for a lot of people, it doesn't matter. And we've referred to people who had it taken an hour or two that was political, which means they're actually outing themselves. And I would think that applies to some people on the right who wanted to immediately politicize this. And it also has applied to some statements I've seen from people on the left who rushed to look at this as caused by something. But from an investigative perspective, we don't have motive yet. Law enforcement's been on it for several days. We know they got the phone, and they don't feel in a position to tell us publicly that the phone has revealed motive. We have clues that are isolated. So he's a registered Republican, but he's made other types of political donations, and we don't have the full context on that. So I do think it's important to remember that what you said is true. Historically, most lone wolf assassinations do not matter that much as to motive over time.
Yeah.
It would matter if, hypothetically, someone was working in concert with a larger organization or a foreign entity, or they were an espionage asset. Then the motive matters a lot because it's an act of war.
Right.
But with, what you said, Rachel, lone wolf attacks historically that use political violence, which often relate to mental illness or other sort of kook attitudes, may not ultimately matter. But that's one question, is why did this happen? Can we figure that out? And then the other vantage point is, why does this happen so much in America? And there's a security failure question for the Secret Service, which has not so far been very forthcoming. And this is a massive failure. Someone tried to shoot a former president in the head.
The whole reason Donald Trump needs a new VP is because he called Mike Pence the P word because he wouldn't be the final nail in his coup coffin, and then left him to die. His supporters wanted to, quote, hang Mike Pence.
And by the way, J.D. Vance has said he would not have certified those electors.
Can I show you what J.D. So J.D. Vance was actually confronted by Fox's Brett Baier about all the things J.D. Vance said about Donald Trump. Let me show you that.
Well, Senator, this is an evolution, and I know you've been asked about this before, about past comments that you've made about Donald Trump. You've said, I'm a never Trump guy, never liked him. Terrible candidate, idiot if you voted for him, might be America's Hitler, might be a cynical a-hole, cultural heroine, noxious and reprehensible.
I was wrong about Donald Trump. I didn't think he was going to be a good president, Brett. He was a great president.
I don't know if the flip-flop doesn't make you throw up in your mouth, the sycophant he's turned into might.
Yeah, I think flip-flopping is baked in the Trump era for Republicans, sadly. As I mentioned, that's why I think the unqualified tag is important. But I think at the base of what you just raised about the reason J.D. Vance is now needed is because Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence has been, disenfranchised by Republicans. But most of Donald Trump's cabinet won't support the former president either, for a fundamental reason. because Donald Trump did try to topple democracy with violence, and Mike Pence refused to do it. And this is important to the context of what we saw in Butler. We don't know the shooter's motivations. Let's say it was political violence, politically motivated. That shooter almost interrupted democracy through violence, through a bullet. On January 6th, Donald Trump led an insurrection to interrupt democracy. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but the crowd was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and Donald Trump watched as that occurred. It is why
sent out a tweet calling him, not the P word, but we know from Ivanka Trump's assistant that that's what he was saying in private.
And as I've said, that the non-legal case here is Donald Trump laid the predicate of a stolen election, issued the invitation for the mob to come to Washington, gave a speech saying, "Go to the Capitol with strength, not with weakness." They only respond to strength. The crowd started chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." There were gallows on the lawn. Donald Trump watched. Donald Trump has tried to undermine our democracy and the American voter. The American experience is not guaranteed. Our experiment is only protected by the leaders we have. Donald Trump has shown not to be faithful to the American experiment. It's why Mike Pence is out and why he wants J.D. Vance to be a sycophant. It's also why, while we share in the national condemnation, we must not suspend our own judgment about who the candidates are in November.
Or our eyes and ears. And I think I mean, you are so elegant, I'm going to be not elegant. If this were dating and Trump were the guy and the first girlfriend that was dating him was Mike Pence, and you say, well, you know, it's not you, it's him. I mean, he left you to actually die. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and he said, yeah, go for it, basically. You would warn the next guy that it might happen to you, too. But I actually can't get beyond, I mean, I've spent 8 years covering Donald Trump, and I've had a lot of critics of Donald Trump on, and a lot of people on the right want to point to the media's coverage. No one has been more vicious to Donald Trump than J.D. Vance. Listen to these insults. He called him a, quote, cynical a-hole. He called him, quote, cultural heroine. He called him, quote, America's Hitler. He said this, I mean, Hillary Clinton's campaign was injured because she called his supporters deplorable. J.D. Vance goes farther. J.D. Vance said this, quote, "You're an idiot if you voted for Donald Trump." He said he was a, quote, terrible candidate. He described himself as a, quote, never Trump guy who, quote, never liked him, Donald Trump.
Yeah, and the interesting thing here is what this says about J.D. Vance's character. Because he says, oh, well, I didn't realize what a great president he was going to be. I got news for everybody. J.D. Vance doesn't believe he was a great president. I don't know any Republican senators that believe that Donald Trump was a great president. And the people that were around him that provided some kind of measure of, no, you can't do that. You can't call out the military to attack protesters in America. And no, you can't do that. You can't go down to the border and just start shooting people. Those people are all gone. And the idea that they picked this guy shows that they're sure that he would never stand for the Constitution before he would stand for Donald Trump. Because he has said that Mike Pence, if he had been the vice president, he wouldn't have certified those electors.
Vaughn Hillard is with us. Vaughn, I think you were there 8 years ago when Donald Trump picked Mike Pence. Now, I don't know, I guess it took me 9 years to work up a well of sympathy for Mike Pence, but poor Mike Pence isn't even there tonight. He's been a lifelong Republican. Mike Pence went along with all of it up until, and then not including the coup. Your thoughts?
It's hard to get a much more loyal vice president, I think, than what Mike Pence was up until January 6, 2021, loyal in terms of the way that Donald Trump views loyalty. I recall I was in Indianapolis when Mike Pence was formally selected there, and I remember the very first interview that he did after being named, and it was with Hannity, and Hannity asked him the question, what are you going to do in the White House when you disagree with Donald Trump? And he said at the time that behind closed doors, he would have that discussion and tell Donald Trump why he disagrees with him. But then when the doors open up, he would come out and stand shoulder to shoulder with the president. And for 4 years, he did exactly that until he did not go forward with Donald Trump's plan to reject the certification of the Electoral College votes on January 6th. And I covered Mike Pence as he went internationally around the country, 3 different foreign trips that I went around the world with him on. And every step of the way, I think he represented the Trump administration in the best light that he could on terms of the agenda, in the way that the U.S. has typically been represented by U.S. presidential administrations of both parties. And so I think to get to this point here with J.D. Vance, I think it shows the level of forgiveness that Donald Trump is willing to offer those who come back to him within this Republican Party. And when, Mike Pence made the decision to go and challenge Donald Trump for the presidency, he well knew that it was going to be an uphill battle. He had watched Liz Cheney handily lose, overwhelmingly lose, in her primary against Harriet Hageman. He watched candidate after candidate go and try to stand up to, the Trump-backed candidates, and yet he still went forward with running for the presidency himself. Mike Pence is not here in Milwaukee today, and of course he sent condolences to Donald Trump here. This is the apparent assassination, which I just want to underscore as somebody who has covered these rallies over the last 9 years. I think underscores the anxiety that myself as a reporter and so many feel about the state of being able to go out on the campaign trail in today in the year of 2024. But I think Mike Pence also experienced to a certain degree that fear himself a couple years ago. And so this is a moment that I don't think our story, we don't understand exactly where it's going. We're living in it in this present time on July 15th, 2024, Nicole.
Vaughn Hilliard, I know you've been reading Project 2025 sort of page by page. It's 900 pages, 600 pages long. Would J.D. Vance and his past statements, let me read them again. You're an idiot if you voted for Trump. He might be America's Hitler. He's a cynical a-hole. He's cultural heroin, obnoxious and reprehensible. Right. Would he pass the loyalty test as outlined by John McEntee and the folks that created Project 2025 to work in a Trump administration if he wasn't the VP pick?
I'm not sure what the statute of limitations is on statements for the team that is putting that personnel together. But let me tell you why J.D. Vance is intriguing real fast, in a nutshell, if I could, for the Project 2025 folks. And that's because of the ability to make civil servants and turn them into political appointees. J.D. Vance has been on the front lines of articulating that, in his words, that 90% of the federal workforce, in his words, are liberals, that at the department and agency level have been barriers to being able to implement conservative policies, and that the Trump administration for 4 years was not able to be as effective as they wanted to be because of liberals, in the words of J.D. Vance, who were in the executive branch under departments and agencies. And J.D. Vance, over the last 2 years, has been on the front lines of calling for what is known Schedule F. This is something that Donald Trump signed as an executive action in October of 2020, just before leaving the White House, which converted a great share of federal workers and made them political appointees so that they would be more easily able to be fired and replaced by conservatives who, again, Project 2025 building this personnel database led by his former director of personnel in the White House, where they would be able to know who was coming in so they could make a more efficient 4 years for Donald Trump. J.D. Vance is somebody who is very astute in understanding how that vision could be implemented at the department and agency levels for a second Trump administration.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.